Hey guys, tonight we begin with the medieval world, a place where half of everyday life was made up on the spot, and the other half was the result of someone forgetting to undo something they did 300 years earlier. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. When emergency taxes first appeared, settle in comfortably. You don't need to remember dates or names tonight. Just let them pass by slowly, like distant bells in fog. Imagine yourself standing in a medieval village sometime in the late 11th century. The air smells of damp soil and wood smoke. Taxes, as you understand them today, barely exist here. Most obligations are paid in labor. Days spent repairing roads, tending a lord's fields, hauling stones, or guarding gates. Coinage is limited. Many people may go their entire lives without holding more than a few silver pennies. And yet, change is already quietly approaching. The earliest medieval taxes were not designed to last. They were created reluctantly, usually during moments of fear. War, famine, crusade, or royal debt forced rulers to invent ways of extracting money quickly. These were meant to be temporary measures, explicitly described as such in charters and proclamations. A king would announce that an emergency required extraordinary funding. Once the crisis passed, the tax would be removed. At least, that was the promise. In early medieval Europe, rulers lacked the administrative tools to enforce permanent taxation. There were no nationwide tax offices, no standing bureaucracies, no reliable census records. Power was personal, local, and fragile. A king who taxed too heavily risked rebellion, desertion, or assassination. So early medieval taxes were framed carefully. They were called aids, subsidies, or extraordinary contributions. Language mattered. A tax was not a tax. It was help freely given, often described as voluntary, even when it clearly was not. One of the earliest examples was the feudal aid. Under feudal custom, a lord could request assistance from his vassals only in specific circumstances: when he was captured and needed ransom, when his eldest son was knighted, when his daughter was married. These were rare events. The payments were small. The system was built on restraint. But once rulers realized money could be extracted during crises, restraint became negotiable. During the Norman period in England, William the Conqueror introduced taxes to support his military control of the kingdom. One such tax was the geld, originally a Danish protection payment meant to buy peace. It was introduced as a temporary defensive measure. The Danes eventually stopped coming. The tax did not. What made the geld dangerous was not its size, but its precedent. It established the idea that land could be systematically assessed and taxed in coin. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, was not just a record of property. It was a taxation tool, a snapshot of wealth frozen in parchment. For ordinary people, this shift was subtle but profound. Instead of owing labor at predictable times, villagers now owed money on fixed schedules, money they often did not have. To pay, they sold grain earlier than planned. They borrowed. They worked extra days. They cut into reserves meant for winter. None of this felt catastrophic at first, just uncomfortable. That discomfort became routine. Across medieval Europe, similar patterns emerged. In France, the taille was introduced as a temporary wartime tax during the 100 Years' War. It was justified as necessary to defend the realm against English invasion. The war dragged on for generations. The tax remained. The justification shifted quietly. What had once been a temporary military necessity became a normal royal income. Eventually, the taille was collected annually, regardless of war or peace. The same story repeated with alarming consistency. Popes levied temporary crusade taxes to fund campaigns in the Holy Land. These were supposed to expire once Jerusalem was secured, but as crusades failed, shifted, or transformed, the taxes stayed, redirected toward new purposes. Emergency taxes funded bureaucracy. Bureaucracy justified taxes. For the medieval peasant, this transformation was rarely explained. Notices were read aloud in churches, often in Latin or formal legal language few understood. Payments were demanded by local officials who themselves barely grasped the larger system. You paid because refusal was dangerous. What made these taxes particularly insidious was their slow normalization. A tax introduced during your youth might still exist when you were old. Your children would grow up assuming it had always been there. Temporary became traditional. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries show villagers referring to taxes as ancient custom, even when historians know they were introduced only decades earlier. Memory softened reality, and rulers learned an important lesson. Once people adapt to a burden, removing it gains little political advantage. So taxes accumulated. New emergencies stacked on old ones. Each tax justified by a unique crisis, none fully repealed. Over time, medieval societies developed layered taxation systems without ever consciously deciding to do so. By the late Middle Ages, kings no longer asked whether they could tax, only how much resistance they might face. Yet at this early stage, people still believed in the promise of temporariness. Chroniclers recorded debates where nobles insisted taxes would end after this war, after this harvest, after this threat. And perhaps, in the beginning, they truly believed it. As you imagine yourself lying awake in a medieval cottage, listening to the wind press against wooden shutters, you might wonder, at what exact moment did a temporary solution become an accepted permanent burden? And did anyone notice when that line was crossed? Settle back in again. The world we're returning to has grown slightly more organized, slightly more crowded with rules, though no one living in it would say so out loud. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, temporary taxes had already proven something important. They worked. They produced money. They funded armies, courts, roads, and royal households. More importantly, they taught rulers that people could be conditioned to pay. What changed next was not greed alone, but administration. To keep collecting temporary taxes, medieval governments had to invent new systems. And once those systems existed, they quietly demanded continued use. Tax collectors, for example, did not disappear when a crisis ended. They needed salaries. Clerks needed parchment. Ledgers needed updating. Suddenly, ending a tax meant dismantling an entire machine, one that now employed loyal servants of the crown. So instead of ending taxes, rulers adjusted their reasoning. A tax that was meant to fund a war became a tax to maintain readiness. A tax raised for defense became one for stability. A tax justified by danger became one justified by tradition. In England, Parliament began approving temporary taxes more frequently. Each approval was framed as exceptional, Yet each added weight to the idea that taxation required consent, not removal. This is where the trap closed quietly. Because taxes were voted on repeatedly, they gained legitimacy. Even when temporary, they felt lawful. And lawful things have a way of staying. The scutage tax is a telling example. Originally introduced so knights could pay money instead of serving in military campaigns, it was meant to be an optional substitution, a practical fix, a convenience. Over time, scutage became expected. Knights paid whether or not campaigns occurred. Military service was replaced by professional soldiers funded by permanent taxation. What began as flexibility became obligation. For ordinary villagers, this meant something subtle but profound. They no longer served a lord they knew, for a cause they understood. They paid into an abstract system whose outcomes were distant and unclear. Money flowed upward. Decisions flowed downward. In France, the crown's ability to collect taxes without noble approval expanded dramatically during the later stages of the Hundred Years' War. Emergency measures justified extraordinary powers. Once peace returned, the crown kept those powers, not because it announced the change, but because it never announced the reversal. People adapted. They always do. Survival in medieval society depended on predictability. Once taxes became predictable, they became manageable. Manageable burdens are rarely challenged. And so households reorganized their lives around taxation. Harvests were planned not only for food, but for payment deadlines. Marriage dowries were adjusted. Land was divided carefully to account for obligations. Even religion played a role. Church leaders often preached obedience, framing taxation as a divine test or a necessary sacrifice. In return, rulers protected ecclesiastical privileges. Temporary taxes blended into moral duty. And yet, resistance simmered quietly. Records from village courts reveal frequent disputes over assessments. Peasants argued valuations. They delayed payments. They negotiated quietly with collectors. Not rebellion, just friction. True rebellion came later. When taxes stacked too high, revolts erupted. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. The Jacquerie in France. Urban uprisings across the Holy Roman Empire. What's striking is not that people rebelled, but how rarely they demanded abolition. Most rebels asked for fairness, limits, or restoration of older customs. They believed temporary taxes had overstayed their welcome, not that taxation itself was illegitimate. Even revolt accepted permanence. By now, medieval rulers had learned something else. Time was their ally. A tax protested in one generation would be accepted by the next. Memory faded. Records stayed. Children born into taxation did not question its origin. They questioned its rate. This is how temporary measures survive, not through force alone, but through familiarity. By the 15th century, medieval taxation systems were no longer crude. They were layered, justified, and defended. Temporary taxes had merged into the structure of governance itself. And still, rulers continued to describe new taxes as temporary, even when no one truly believed it. As you lie there now, listening to the slow breath of centuries passing, you might find yourself wondering, if everyone knew these taxes would never disappear, why did the language of temporary necessity persist so stubbornly, long after its truth had faded? settle in once more. By now, the world we're visiting no longer feels improvised. It feels settled, heavy with habits that no one remembers choosing. By the late medieval period, roughly the 14th to 15th centuries, temporary taxes were no longer merely surviving. They were shaping the very idea of what government was. Rulers no longer governed only through personal authority, land ownership, or military loyalty. They governed through revenue. And revenue required continuity. At this stage, something important changed in how people thought about obligation. Earlier generations had seen taxes as interruptions, unpleasant but finite disruptions to normal life. Now they were part of the background, like seasons or church bells. Predictable, annoying, inescapable. This normalization altered medieval society in quiet ways. For example, record-keeping expanded dramatically. Taxation required documentation, names, lands, values, exemptions. What began as lists for emergency collections evolved into permanent registries. These registries created identities fixed on parchment. You were no longer just someone who lived near the mill. You were a taxable unit. This mattered because once someone is recorded, they are remembered. And remembered people can be charged again. Governments discovered that forgetting was expensive. In England, the Exchequer developed increasingly sophisticated methods of accounting. Wooden tally sticks, originally meant as simple receipts, became long-term financial records. Some of these sticks remained in use for centuries, long after the original tax purposes were forgotten. In France, royal tax officials became permanent regional figures. Their authority outlived individual kings. Even when dynasties changed, the taxes stayed. This permanence reshaped power. Medieval kings had once needed constant negotiation with nobles, but reliable taxation reduced that dependency. With steady income, rulers could pay professional soldiers instead of relying on feudal levies. Standing armies emerged, another temporary solution that became permanent. And standing armies required more taxes. This feedback loop, tax funds power, power enforces tax, quietly solidified. No single decree announced it. No dramatic reform marked the moment. It simply became how things worked. For ordinary people, this meant distance. The money you paid no longer clearly connected to a specific event. You were not funding this war or that ransom. You were funding the system itself. Roads you might never walk. Courts you might never enter. Campaigns fought far away. The connection between sacrifice and benefit grew abstract. Some medieval writers noticed this unease. Chroniclers occasionally complained that taxes were collected without clear cause. But these complaints rarely changed policy. They were absorbed into the background noise of governance. What's striking is how little effort rulers made to pretend taxes would end, and how much effort they made to justify why they couldn't. New language appeared. Taxes were framed as necessary for order, peace, and continuity. Stability itself became the crisis that justified permanent collection. And stability, once named, is difficult to argue against. By the end of the Middle Ages, the idea that taxes were temporary had not disappeared. It had become ceremonial. A ritual phrase spoken at the beginning of new levies, repeated out of habit rather than belief. People still grumbled. They always would. But they planned their lives around taxation as surely as around harvests and holy days. This acceptance did not mean people approved. It meant they adapted. Adaptation is quieter than resistance, more durable, and so medieval taxation left a legacy far larger than money. It taught governments that temporary solutions could be extended indefinitely. It taught populations that burdens could be endured if introduced slowly enough. It taught both sides that permanence often arrives disguised as emergency. When modern states later built income taxes, property taxes, and national budgets, they were not inventing something new. They were inheriting medieval habits, refined, standardized, but deeply familiar. You can trace a straight line from a frightened medieval king raising an emergency levy to modern tax codes spanning thousands of pages, all of it rooted in the same assumption. Once something works, it does not need to end. As you rest with this thought, you might notice how familiar it feels. How often temporary measures in your own world quietly become permanent fixtures. How rarely systems dismantle themselves once built. And perhaps the most unsettling question of all drifts in gently at the edge of sleep. How many of the things governing your daily life were once introduced as short-term necessities? And at what point did they stop being questioned? Settle in gently for the final time with this first story. Nothing dramatic happens here. No revolutions succeed. No grand reforms sweep the land. Instead, something far more common and far more enduring takes place. Life simply continues. By the early modern period, the medieval world is already fading, though few people living through it realize that fact. Clothing styles change. Weapons improve. Cities grow louder. Yet the systems built centuries earlier remain, quietly embedded beneath daily routines. Temporary taxes are no longer discussed as temporary at all. They have become invisible. This invisibility is perhaps their greatest achievement. When a burden is new, people notice it. When it is old, they organize around it. By the 16th century, taxation was no longer debated as a moral question in most of Europe. It was debated as a technical one. How much, from whom, and how efficiently? This shift matters. Because once a system becomes technical rather than moral, it stops asking whether it should exist, only how to improve its performance. You can see this change clearly in surviving documents. Earlier charters argue why a tax is necessary. Later records focus on how to collect it more accurately. Appeals become rarer. Exemptions become more formalized. Resistance turns into paperwork. And paperwork is patient. For ordinary people, this meant that taxes were no longer shocking events. They were background expectations. Children grew up watching their parents set aside grain or coin months in advance. Payment days were marked not with outrage, but with resignation. The emotional response softened, not because the burden was lighter, but because it was predictable. Predictability is comforting, even when it hurts. This psychological adaptation may be one of the most important legacies of medieval taxation. People learned that systems could outlast lifetimes, that protest might flare briefly, but structure endured, that survival meant accommodation. And rulers learned the same lesson from the opposite side. They learned that once a population adjusts to an obligation, removing it brings no reward. Ending a tax rarely made a ruler popular enough to justify the loss of income. Keeping it maintained stability. So taxes stayed. Even when medieval governments collapsed, their fiscal habits survived. New rulers inherited old ledgers. New states inherited old obligations. Conquest changed flags, not systems. This continuity explains why so many modern tax concepts feel ancient, because they are. Land assessments, property valuation, progressive rates, exemptions for clergy or elites. All of these existed in recognizable form by the late Middle Ages. They were not designed carefully from scratch. They evolved accidentally, layered crisis upon crisis. The medieval world did not plan permanence. It stumbled into it. And that may be the most unsettling lesson of all, because nothing about these taxes required malice. Most were introduced by rulers facing genuine emergencies. Wars, invasions, debts, instability. The intention was often sincere. The promises may even have been honest at the time. But intention does not determine outcome. Structure does. Once administrative systems exist, they seek continuation. Once people adapt, reversal becomes unlikely. Once a temporary solution solves enough problems, it stops being temporary in practice, even if it remains temporary in name. You can trace this logic forward without difficulty. Modern societies still introduce temporary taxes, fees, and emergency measures. They still rely on the same language medieval rulers used: necessity, stability, security, responsibility. And just like then, removal is always harder than introduction. The medieval experience shows that permanence is rarely declared. It emerges quietly, through repetition and habit. And so, as this first story ends, you are left not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a gentle realization. History is not only shaped by grand events. It is shaped by small decisions made under pressure, decisions that seem reasonable, temporary, and harmless at the time, until they are not temporary anymore. As you let your thoughts slow, one final question lingers softly, without demanding an answer. If medieval people could not see which temporary measures would last forever, how certain can anyone be that they recognize them in their own time? Laws written in a hurry. Settle in again. This next story begins not with intention, but with panic. Imagine a medieval town at dusk. The gates are closing earlier than usual. A bell rings, not for prayer, but for warning. Something has gone wrong. A fire, a riot, a disease, a rumor of invasion. In moments like these, medieval authorities did not debate philosophy or long-term consequences. They acted, and they acted quickly. Emergency laws were never meant to last. They were written in haste, enforced harshly, and justified by necessity. Everyone understood this. These were exceptions, not foundations. Temporary suspensions of normal life, meant to restore order. But just like temporary taxes, many of these laws never went away. In the medieval world, law was deeply local. Each town, manor, or region operated under a patchwork of customs. Kings issued edicts, but enforcement depended on local officials. This flexibility allowed emergency laws to slip quietly into everyday practice. When a crisis ended, no one always bothered to undo what had been written. One of the earliest examples comes from curfews. The word itself is medieval, couvre-feu, meaning cover the fire. In Norman-controlled towns, curfews were introduced to prevent nighttime fires and unrest. Residents were required to extinguish hearth fires at a set hour and remain indoors. The purpose was clear: safety and control. The intention was temporary, but curfews worked. Fires decreased, streets grew quieter. Authority became easier to maintain. So the rules stayed, even as the original danger faded. Over time, curfews evolved. Fires were no longer the reason. Control was. And centuries later, curfews still appeared during unrest, pandemics, and emergencies, the same medieval logic resurfacing under modern language. Another quiet survivor of medieval emergency law is quarantine. During outbreaks of plague, cities like Venice, Genoa, and Ragusa imposed isolation rules on ships and travelers. 40 days, quaranta giorni, was chosen not for scientific reasons, but symbolic and religious ones. These measures were drastic. Trade halted. Families were separated. Entire households were sealed inside their homes. Everyone understood this was extraordinary. Yet quarantine procedures proved effective enough to be repeated. Ports kept quarantine stations even between outbreaks. Health officials gained permanent authority. What was once an emergency tool became an institutional practice. Medieval lawmakers did not set out to invent public health systems. They reacted to fear, and fear built infrastructure. Emergency laws also reshaped policing. In many medieval towns, night watches were organized only during times of danger, war, unrest, or disease. Ordinary life did not require constant patrols. Neighbors policed themselves through reputation and familiarity. But emergency watches brought order. Crime dropped. Authority became visible. So watches stayed. Gradually, temporary patrols evolved into permanent forces. The idea that public order required constant monitoring became normal. By the late Middle Ages, many cities maintained standing watches year-round. Modern policing traces part of its origin to these emergency measures, systems built not for justice, but for crisis control. Perhaps the most overlooked emergency laws involved movement. During famine, war, or plague, medieval authorities restricted travel. Peasants were forbidden to leave their villages. Beggars were expelled. Strangers were viewed as threats. These restrictions were meant to last only until stability returned. But records show that many towns kept travel controls in place long after emergencies ended. Passes, permissions, and documentation became normal. The idea that movement required authorization, that you must prove who you are and where you belong, hardened slowly. And it never fully softened again. What's important here is not malice. Most emergency laws were introduced by people genuinely trying to protect their communities. Mayors, abbots, magistrates. Many of them feared chaos more than injustice. And chaos, in the medieval world, was deadly. Food shortages, fire, disease, and violence could wipe out entire towns. Emergency laws felt necessary because they often were. But necessity has a way of overstaying. Once a rule exists, it offers solutions beyond its original purpose. Once authority is granted, it seeks justification to remain. And ordinary people adapt. You learn when not to go outside. You learn which streets are watched. You learn how to carry papers, obey signals, stay invisible. Soon, these habits feel natural. By the late medieval period, entire legal traditions rested on precedents set during emergencies. Judges cited crisis-era laws as justification for normal rulings. Temporary exceptions became permanent references. Law, like memory, accumulates. What began as reaction becomes foundation. And this raises an unsettling realization. Many of the rules governing modern life did not emerge from careful design, but from fear-driven improvisation centuries ago. They were written quickly, enforced unevenly, extended quietly, and most people living under them never knew they were supposed to be temporary. As you let this thought drift slowly, another question begins to form, not urgently, but persistently. If laws born in crisis become normal without announcement, how many rules shaping your life today began as emergency measures no one ever remembered to undo? When emergency laws settled into daily life. Rest again. The danger that once justified the law has faded, but the law itself remains, quietly waiting, like a chair left in the corner long after the guest has gone home. By the later Middle Ages, emergency laws were no longer rare interruptions. They had become part of the rhythm of governance. What began as temporary responses to chaos slowly embedded themselves into everyday expectations, not through dramatic declarations, but through routine. This process was subtle. When an emergency ended, medieval authorities rarely gathered to repeal laws. There was no ceremony for returning to normal. Instead, officials simply stopped talking about the crisis and continued enforcing whatever rules were convenient to keep. Silence did much of the work. Take market regulations, for example. During shortages or unrest, towns imposed strict controls on prices, weights, and selling hours. Hoarding was punished. Bread sizes were standardized. Vendors were watched closely. These were emergency measures meant to prevent starvation and riots. But once towns discovered that regulated markets reduced conflict, many rules stayed. Officials argued that order was better than freedom, predictability better than negotiation. Over time, emergency price controls hardened into permanent commercial law. Merchants adapted. Consumers adjusted. The crisis justification faded, but the structure remained. Another quiet survivor was summary justice. In moments of unrest, medieval courts often suspended lengthy legal procedures. Quick judgments were delivered to discourage disorder. Trials were shortened. Appeals ignored. Punishments made public. Everyone understood this was dangerous, but necessary for the moment. Yet once authorities experienced the efficiency of fast justice, they struggled to give it up. Emergency courts became models for permanent tribunals. The idea that speed mattered more than deliberation gained acceptance. Efficiency became virtue, and virtue became precedent. Emergency laws also reshaped labor control. After the Black Death, Europe faced severe labor shortages. In response, rulers enacted emergency statutes fixing wages and restricting worker movement. These laws were justified as temporary stabilizers to prevent economic collapse. They were never meant to last. But once elites benefited from controlled labor costs, repeal became unlikely. Workers who tried to move freely were punished. Wage ceilings remained long after the population recovered. In England, the statute of laborers lingered for decades, enforced unevenly but persistently. It shaped employer-employee relationships long after its original emergency passed. Once again, adaptation did the work. Workers learned to navigate the rules. Employers learned to exploit them. Authorities learned that control could be normalized. The emergency faded. The law stayed. Even religious authority absorbed emergency logic. During crises, church leaders issued temporary dispensations, shortened fasting rules, relaxed obligations, altered rituals. These were meant to ease survival. Some of these exceptions never reversed. Over time, emergency religious practices became tradition. People forgot the original reason for change. Doctrine quietly adjusted around necessity. Necessity became sacred. Perhaps the most enduring transformation occurred in record keeping. Emergency laws required documentation. Who had permission to travel? Who was exempt from quarantine? Who owed fines? Who violated curfew? Once documentation existed, it became useful beyond emergencies. Records allowed tracking, taxation, classification. Authorities learned that paper extended memory, and memory extended power. Medieval governments became less dependent on personal knowledge and more reliant on written proof. Identity shifted from reputation to record. You were no longer known because others recognized you, but because documents said you existed. This change did not feel dramatic at the time. It felt practical, and practical things are rarely questioned. For ordinary people, the effect was gradual erosion of choice. Not sudden oppression, but accumulation. Each emergency law limited behavior slightly. Each leftover rule narrowed space. Individually, they felt tolerable. Collectively, they reshaped life. You could go fewer places freely, trade under fewer conditions, speak in fewer ways during unrest, appeal less often, move less easily. Yet because each rule arrived with justification, fire, plague, famine, war, resistance felt unreasonable. Who argues against safety? By the late medieval period, emergency laws had done something profound. They redefined what normal meant. Normal life now included surveillance, restrictions, documentation, and enforcement mechanisms that earlier generations would have found alarming. But no one remembered that earlier world clearly. Memory faded faster than law. And so medieval society passed its emergency structures forward, not as warnings, but as inheritances. Later generations did not ask why these rules existed. They asked how to use them. As you let this realization settle gently, another question drifts into view, quiet but persistent. If emergency laws become ordinary simply by surviving long enough, how can anyone tell when normal is actually the echo of a forgotten crisis? The long shadow of forgotten emergencies. Settle in for the last time with this story. The crisis has long passed. The danger is no longer visible. Yet the rules remain, steady, unquestioned, and quietly powerful. By the end of the medieval period, emergency laws had done something remarkable. They had outlived their causes and outgrown their explanations. What was once justified by fire, famine, plague, or unrest now justified itself simply by existing. And this is where their true legacy begins. When medieval societies moved into the early modern world, they did not reset their legal systems. They carried them forward. Kings changed, borders shifted, technologies advanced. But the emergency laws embedded in daily life traveled easily into the future because they were useful. Curfews, quarantines, travel permits, labor controls, market regulations, and rapid justice mechanisms all shared one trait. They simplified governance. They made populations easier to manage, easier to track, easier to predict. Once a society experiences that level of administrative clarity, letting it go feels irresponsible. So instead of asking whether a rule should remain, authorities asked how it could be refined. Emergency laws became frameworks. Consider quarantine, which began as an improvised medieval defense against plague. By the 17th century, It was no longer a desperate response, it was policy. Quarantine stations were maintained permanently. Health boards gained authority. The idea that the state could restrict movement for collective safety became accepted. No one called it medieval anymore. The origin disappeared beneath layers of refinement. The same happened with curfews. Originally meant to prevent fire and unrest, they evolved into tools for managing social order during any perceived instability. Cities discovered that curfews reduced crime, limited gathering, and made enforcement easier. They were no longer emergency measures. They were options. Emergency laws also reshaped the relationship between people and authority. Earlier medieval life relied heavily on mutual recognition. Communities governed themselves through familiarity, reputation, and informal pressure. Emergency laws replaced this with enforcement by rule. You did not behave because your neighbors watched. You behaved because the law existed, and it did not need to explain itself. This shift encouraged obedience to systems rather than to people. Over time, this made authority less personal and more abstract. Orders no longer came from a known figure. They came from the law itself. And laws written during emergencies often assume worst-case behavior. They expect disobedience. They anticipate danger. They prioritize control. When such laws become normal, society quietly adopts a posture of suspicion. Surveillance feels reasonable. Restrictions feel prudent. Documentation feels necessary. Not because people are dangerous, but because the law was designed during danger. This mindset carried forward into modern legal thinking. Many contemporary legal principles trace their roots to emergency reasoning. The idea that rights may be suspended temporarily. The belief that safety justifies restriction. The assumption that extraordinary measures can be normalized. These ideas were not invented by modern states. They were inherited. And inheritance is powerful because it feels legitimate. Most people living under these systems never ask where they came from. They experience them as neutral facts of life. Forms to fill, rules to follow, limits to accept. The medieval emergency becomes invisible, and yet its shape remains. You can see it when governments respond to crises today. The language is familiar: necessity, order, stability, protection. Temporary measures are introduced. Reassurances are given. Time passes. Some measures fade. Some do not. And just like in the medieval world, removal proves harder than introduction. Systems built under pressure rarely dismantle themselves willingly. They wait for justification to remain, and justification is always available if one looks hard enough. This does not mean emergency laws are evil. Many saved lives. Many prevented chaos. Many were necessary. But necessity is not permanence. The medieval experience shows that societies rarely pause to distinguish between the two. And so the greatest impact of medieval emergency laws is not any single rule that survived, but the pattern they established. A pattern where fear accelerates lawmaking, where speed replaces deliberation, where exceptions linger longer than expected. A pattern where the temporary quietly reshapes the permanent. As this story comes to rest, there is no dramatic conclusion to offer, no simple lesson to enforce, only a gentle awareness. History suggests that what feels normal often began as extraordinary, that many of the structures guiding daily life are echoes of problems long forgotten. that laws outlive memories, and sometimes outlive their usefulness. And so, as you let your thoughts slow and drift, one final question remains, soft enough to carry into sleep. If societies rarely remember which rules were meant to be temporary, how can anyone be certain when an emergency has truly ended? Settle in once more. This final section does not introduce a new crisis. Instead, it lingers in the long aftermath, the quiet stretch of time when no bells are ringing, no fires are burning, and no enemy stands at the gate. Life appears ordinary again, and yet the emergency has not truly ended. By the late medieval and early modern periods, societies across Europe had learned something subtle but decisive. Emergencies were not interruptions to normal life, they were part of it. Fire, famine, disease, unrest, and war came often enough that preparing for crisis felt like realism, not pessimism. And so laws born in panic did not feel out of place once the panic passed. They felt prudent. This is how emergency laws completed their transformation, not into tyranny, but into expectation. Consider documentation. During crises, medieval authorities required written proof for movement, trade, or exemption. These papers were meant to be temporary safeguards, used only while danger persisted. But once people grew accustomed to carrying proof, it felt irresponsible to abandon the practice. Documents prevented fraud. They clarified identity. They simplified enforcement. Soon, the absence of documentation felt suspicious. What had once been extraordinary became the baseline. The same pattern applied to surveillance. Emergency watchmen were introduced to guard streets during unrest. Their presence reassured frightened populations. Crime decreased. Order felt tangible. When the unrest ended, removing watchmen felt like inviting disorder back in. So patrols stayed. Over time, being observed became normal. Privacy was not removed by decree. It simply eroded through habit. Medieval people did not talk about rights in the modern sense, but they understood autonomy. They knew when they were free to move, trade, and speak without scrutiny. Emergency laws gradually narrowed these spaces, and because each narrowing was justified, few objected. This is the most important dynamic of all. Emergency laws did not survive because people loved them. They survived because people adapted to them. Adaptation is powerful. Once routines form, resistance feels disruptive. Once rules are internalized, enforcement requires less force. People begin policing themselves, adjusting behavior to avoid trouble rather than challenging authority. Medieval governments noticed this. They learned that emergency laws train populations, that obedience practiced during crisis carried forward into calm, that fear left behind habits long after it faded. And so rulers stopped thinking of emergency laws as temporary tools. They became templates. When a new crisis emerged, authorities reached for familiar instruments. Curfews, restrictions, documentation, summary justice. The same shapes, reused again and again. Over centuries, this repetition created continuity. Medieval emergency logic flowed smoothly into early modern governance, then into modern statecraft, not as medieval law, but as inherited instinct. You can see this inheritance clearly when reading later legal codes. Clauses allowing suspension of normal procedure, provisions granting extraordinary powers, until further notice. Vague language designed to expand rather than limit authority. None of this required medieval lawmakers to be clever or manipulative. They were simply reacting and leaving behind tools that others would reuse. This is why emergency laws are so difficult to undo. They are rarely debated on their merits once established. They are defended by precedent. They are justified by possibility rather than probability. What if it happens again? Becomes reason enough. And because emergencies do happen again, the logic reinforces itself. For ordinary people, this produces a strange historical experience. You live under rules whose origins no one remembers. You accept restrictions that once felt extreme. You follow procedures introduced by long-dead officials responding to dangers long gone. And it all feels normal. This is not failure. It is continuity. History shows that societies rarely return to previous states of freedom or informality after crisis. They move forward, carrying structures with them. They accumulate rules the way buildings accumulate layers, one built atop another, rarely removed. The medieval world passed down many such layers. And perhaps the quietest legacy of all is this: the idea that safety and control are naturally linked. That order requires oversight. That restriction is a reasonable price for stability. These assumptions did not arise from philosophy. They arose from fear. And fear, once it builds systems, does not dismantle them easily. As this story finally comes to rest, there is no call to alarm, no demand for judgment, only a gentle recognition. Much of what governs daily life did not come from careful planning or long-term wisdom. It came from people doing their best under pressure and leaving behind solutions that worked well enough to survive. Emergency laws did not conquer society. They simply stayed. And so, as your thoughts drift slower, one last question settles quietly beside you, not to be answered now, or perhaps ever. If the rules that feel most permanent were born in moments of fear, what does that say about how history chooses what endures? The arrangement that was never supposed to last. Settle in. This story begins not with chains or cruelty, but with agreement. Imagine a stretch of European countryside in the early Middle Ages. The Roman Empire has collapsed. Roads crumble, trade shrinks, coins disappear from circulation. Authority is fragmented, and danger is common. Raids, famine, lawlessness, uncertainty. In this world, freedom is not yet a stable condition. Survival is. Serfdom, as it first emerged, was not designed as a permanent social class. It was a solution, an improvised arrangement meant to stabilize life during long periods of insecurity. To understand this, you need to forget the later image of serfdom as rigid and inevitable. In its early form, it was flexible, local, and, most importantly, conditional. A free peasant might choose to bind himself to a lord's land. In exchange, he received protection, access to land, and inclusion within a functioning estate. The lord gained labor, loyalty, and predictable production. This was not slavery. It was dependency, negotiated, uneven, and often temporary in intention. Early medieval documents describe peasants commending themselves to a lord. The language is revealing. Commendation implies trust, not captivity. The assumption was that once stability returned, people might reclaim independence. And in many places, they did. Serfdom expanded most rapidly in moments of collapse. After invasions, after wars, after plagues, when central authority weakened, local power filled the gap. Lords offered security where kings could not, and people accepted. It is easy, from a modern distance, to see this as exploitation. But from within the medieval mindset, the calculation was different. Freedom without food or safety was not freedom at all. Land mattered more than liberty. A serf was tied to the soil because the soil fed him. His obligations were heavy: labor days, rents, restrictions on movement, but they were predictable. Predictability meant survival. And crucially, many believed this arrangement would ease once conditions improved. Serfdom was justified as a response to disorder, not a permanent hierarchy. Early legal codes reflect this expectation. Obligations varied widely. Some peasants owed only a few days of labor per year. Others paid rents instead. Many could negotiate terms, inherit land, or purchase freedom. There was no single system called serfdom. There were hundreds of local customs, all shaped by necessity. What unified them was the belief that dependence was situational, and situations change. But as with taxes and emergency laws, something happened when solutions began to work. Stability returned, slowly, unevenly, but the structures built during crisis remained. Lords discovered that bound labor ensured steady income. Estates functioned more smoothly when people stayed put. Control reduced uncertainty. So temporary arrangements hardened. Custom replaced choice. Children born to serfs inherited obligations that were never meant for them. What began as voluntary dependency became inherited status, not by declaration, but by habit. No one announced, "Serfdom is now permanent." It simply became normal to assume that those born on the land belonged to it. Legal language shifted subtly. Early documents describe obligations as agreements. Later ones describe them as facts. This land has always been worked this way. Memory overwrote origin, and peasants adapted. They married within the system, planned lives around labor obligations, built traditions inside restriction. Over time, serfdom felt less like an emergency measure and more like the natural order of things. Even as conditions improved, this is the most important irony of serfdom. It spread fastest during instability, but lasted longest during recovery. Once trade revived and towns grew, lords had even more incentive to retain control over rural labor. Surplus production meant profit. Profit encouraged enforcement, and enforcement transformed flexibility into permanence. Yet resistance existed quietly. Court records reveal serfs suing for freedom based on forgotten charters. Villages remembered older customs. Some peasants fled to towns, where residence for a year and a day could grant freedom. These acts suggest something important. People still believed serfdom was not inevitable. They believed it could end, because originally it was not meant to be forever. As you rest with this early moment, before the system fully hardened, a gentle question begins to form. At what point did a survival strategy become a social destiny? And who decided that temporary dependence should last for generations? Rest again. The fields are quieter now, more orderly. The chaos that once justified dependence has faded into memory, but the dependence itself remains, settled into the soil like a deep-rooted crop. By the high medieval period, roughly the 11th to 13th centuries, serfdom had crossed an invisible boundary. What had once been a flexible response to instability had become something fixed, inherited, and increasingly difficult to escape. This transformation did not happen through a single law or decree. It happened through routine. Once estates stabilized, lords began to document obligations more carefully. Labor days were recorded, fines standardized, customs written down as they had always been. Writing froze arrangements that had once been negotiable, and once written, they became harder to change. Children born on an estate were assumed to belong to it, not because anyone had decided this consciously, but because no alternative had been established. Freedom required proof. Dependence required none. This quiet shift reversed the burden of justification. Earlier, a lord had to explain why someone owed labor. Now, a peasant had to explain why he should not. And explanations were difficult to produce when memory was short and documents were long. Serfdom became less about protection and more about predictability. Lords depended on steady labor to meet obligations of their own: taxes, military support, church dues. Losing workers meant losing stability. So movement was restricted. Marriage required permission. Travel required approval. Leaving the land meant fines or punishment. These controls were framed as preservation of order, not cruelty. And again, they were often justified as temporary safeguards. But safeguards that protect power tend to stay in place. For the serf, daily life was shaped by obligation rather than choice. Work rhythms were dictated by the estate calendar. Personal ambition narrowed to survival within limits. Yet within these limits, people built lives. They formed families, celebrated festivals, passed down skills. Serfdom did not eliminate humanity, it constrained it. And constraint, when endured long enough, becomes familiar. This familiarity is what allowed serfdom to persist even as economic conditions improved. As markets revived and money returned, lords converted labor obligations into cash rents, but maintained legal control over people. The form changed. The dependence stayed. Ironically, prosperity strengthened the system. As land values rose, so did the incentive to bind labor. Lords enforced old customs more strictly, not less. What had once been relaxed during hardship hardened during abundance. And peasants noticed. Records from manorial courts show increasing disputes. Serfs challenged fines, argued inheritance rights, sought exemptions. They were not passive, but resistance was localized and fragmented. Without centralized authority on their side, peasants relied on memory, custom, and negotiation. Occasionally, they won. Some villages secured charters of freedom. Some regions weakened serfdom significantly. But these successes were uneven and often temporary, because once again, the system itself resisted dismantling. Serfdom now supported broader structures. It fed tax systems. It stabilized food supply. It anchored social hierarchy. Removing it threatened more than one interest. So even when kings intervened, they did so cautiously. Royal courts sometimes limited abuses, but rarely abolished serfdom outright. Doing so would have destabilized estates, and stability was always valued over justice. This reveals the core truth of serfdom's endurance. It survived not because everyone approved, but because too many systems depended on it. dependence stacked upon dependence. And so, a temporary solution to chaos became a permanent inheritance for millions. Not because history planned it, but because no moment ever arrived when undoing it felt urgent enough. People adapted, lords benefited, governments relied on it. And adaptation is quieter than reform. As this section comes to rest, you might find yourself lingering on a subtle realization. If serfdom became permanent simply by outlasting the crisis that created it, what other arrangements in history, or in your own world, exist today not because they are necessary, but because no one ever remembered to undo them? Cracks in the system that refuse to close. Rest once more. The land you are standing on has been worked the same way for generations now. The boundaries are familiar. The obligations are known. And yet, beneath this appearance of permanence, the ground is beginning to shift. By the late medieval period, serfdom was no longer new, no longer justified by chaos, and no longer accepted without question. The system had settled into place, but it had also begun to strain under its own weight. What changed was not law at first, but circumstance. Population growth returned after long centuries of instability. Towns expanded. Trade routes reopened. Coinage circulated more widely. Markets offered alternatives to land-based survival. For the first time in generations, peasants could imagine a life that did not depend entirely on a lord's estate. And imagination is dangerous to rigid systems. Serfdom depended on immobility. It required people to stay where they were born, work where they were assigned, and inherit obligations without protest. But economic revival rewarded movement. Skilled labor was needed in towns. Wages became possible. Choice, however limited, reappeared. This created tension. Lords responded predictably. They enforced obligations more strictly. Old customs were revived and reinterpreted in their favor. Court records multiplied. Punishments became more standardized. Control increased precisely because it was becoming harder to maintain. Peasants, meanwhile, began to test boundaries. Some fled. Some negotiated. Some used the law itself, citing forgotten privileges, appealing to royal courts, exploiting inconsistencies between local customs. Others moved quietly, seasonally, temporarily, hoping not to be noticed. And some resisted openly. Uprisings did not come from nowhere. They came from long accumulation, from generations of adaptation reaching its limit. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England is often remembered for its violence, but its demands were remarkably restrained. Rebels did not call for chaos. They demanded an end to serfdom, fair rents, and recognition that obligations introduced during crisis had no place in a changed world. Their argument was simple: the emergency was over. The system should have ended. Authorities disagreed. The revolt was crushed. Leaders were executed. Promises were withdrawn. And yet, something irreversible had occurred. The idea that serfdom was not natural had been spoken aloud. Once said, it could not be unsaid. Across Europe, similar tensions emerged. In some regions, serfdom weakened quietly. Lords commuted labor services for rent. Legal distinctions blurred. In others, control tightened, especially where landowners feared losing authority. The system fractured unevenly. What's important is that serfdom did not collapse everywhere at once. It retreated in some places, entrenched itself in others. and transformed rather than vanished. This reveals something crucial. Serfdom was not sustained by universal belief, it was sustained by structure. Where alternative economic arrangements existed, serfdom weakened. Where they did not, it endured. This means serfdom was never inevitable. It was conditional, but conditions change at different speeds. Even as some peasants gained freedom, others remained bound. Generations lived side by side under different rules. Freedom became regional, not universal. And this created a quiet injustice that felt normal only because it was unevenly visible. Authorities responded pragmatically. Rather than abolishing serfdom, they managed its decline. They allowed exceptions, issued charters, turned obligations into fees. This gradualism preserved stability, but prolonged dependence. And so, serfdom entered its final phase not as a clearly defined institution, but as a fading pattern. Some people still bound, some newly free, many uncertain where they stood. Uncertainty favors power, because when rules are unclear, enforcement becomes discretionary, and discretion is authority's favorite tool. By the end of the Middle Ages, serfdom no longer looked the same as it had at its height, but it had not disappeared. It lingered, adapted, and waited, much like the temporary measures that created it. Its original justification had vanished. Its presence remained. As you rest with this moment, this slow unraveling that is not yet an ending, a final question for this part drifts gently into view. If serfdom survived long after the fear that created it had passed, what finally broke the system? And why did it take so long for something so temporary to begin letting go? How a temporary system finally began to let go. Settle in for the final time with this story. There is no sudden collapse waiting here. No single law that ends serfdom everywhere at once. What follows instead is slower, quieter, and more typical of how history actually changes. Serfdom did not end because someone decided it should. It ended because it gradually stopped working. By the late medieval and early modern periods, the conditions that had once justified serfdom were no longer dominant. Central authority strengthened. Trade networks expanded. Money became common. Towns offered alternatives to life on the land. The world that had required tight, local dependence was giving way to something more mobile and complex. And serfdom struggled to adapt. Lords found it increasingly difficult to keep people bound when opportunities existed elsewhere. Enforcement required effort, courts, officials, and cooperation. Each escape, each exemption, each negotiated rent weakened the system's coherence. Control became expensive. At the same time, rulers began to see serfdom as an obstacle rather than an asset. Bound labor limited economic growth. Free peasants paid taxes more reliably. Mobile workers filled armies and cities. What once stabilized society now slowed it. This was not a moral realization. It was a practical one. In some regions, monarchs intervened directly. They limited the harshest obligations, encouraged commutation of labor into rent, granted freedoms selectively. These reforms were cautious, incremental, and uneven, designed to preserve order while loosening dependence. In other regions, serfdom persisted far longer, especially where landowners retained strong local power and alternatives remained scarce. Eastern Europe, in particular, saw serfdom harden even as it declined in the West. This unevenness is important. It reminds us that serfdom was never a single institution with a single fate. It was a pattern, one that could weaken in one place and intensify in another, depending on incentives. What finally undermined serfdom most effectively was not law, but choice. When people could leave, negotiate, or refuse, even in small numbers, the logic of binding weakened. Dependence relies on the absence of alternatives. Once alternatives exist, coercion must increase to compensate. And increasing coercion exposes the system's fragility. Over generations, serfdom faded into other forms of obligation. Rents replaced labor. Contracts replaced custom. Class replaced status. Dependence did not disappear, it changed shape. Many former serfs became tenants. Some became wage laborers. Others migrated to towns. Freedom arrived gradually, unevenly, and often without ceremony. No one woke up one morning and realized serfdom was over. They simply stopped living under it. And yet, its legacy remained. Land inequality persisted. Social hierarchy survived. The habit of tying people's worth to productivity endured. Even the idea that stability requires restriction echoes the logic that once justified serfdom. Temporary dependence left a long shadow. Looking back, it becomes clear that serfdom lasted not because it was inevitable, but because it was useful, until it wasn't. It solved a problem, then outlived that problem, then slowly dissolved as new solutions emerged. This is the pattern you have seen again and again in these stories. Temporary measures do not announce their expiration. They wait for conditions to change around them. And even then, they resist letting go. Serfdom was meant to be short-term. It became generational. And it ended not with justice, but with irrelevance. As this story finally comes to rest, there is no demand for judgment, only a quiet awareness. History is filled with arrangements created to manage fear, instability, and survival. Many of them last far longer than anyone intended, not because they are right, but because they become familiar. And familiarity is powerful. So one last question settles softly, ready to drift with you into sleep. If serfdom survived centuries simply by adapting to new conditions, how many systems around you today exist not because they were chosen, but because they were never quite released?